hour than early today. It's my privilege to introduce the second session on World Federalism, the Doomsday Clock, and the Summit of the Future, following Honorable Tadashi Inuzuka's introduction of an earlier session today oriented for different time zones. And I hope and trust that we'll hear over the course of the discussion about his remarkable work as a leader of the 3+3 initiative for a nuclear-free zone in Northeast Asia. I am Rebecca Hsu, the Executive Director of Citizens for Global Solutions, which is the U.S. member organization of the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy. And just a slight correction that I'm the co-convener of the Washington Working Group for the International Criminal Court, and also a senior advisor to parliamentarians for nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament. And while I could add to Amy's brief introduction of today's speaker, recitation of his accolades and the many hats that Alyn Ware wears, would doubtless exceed the time allotted for today's talk. So suffice to say that when Alyn received the Right Livelihood Award, as Amy said, alternatively known as the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize, he was hailed as one of the world's most effective peace workers, and the distinction recognized his effective and creative advocacy and initiatives over 2 decades to further peace education and to rid the world of nuclear weapons. And not to age you, Alyn, but perhaps we're in the 3rd decade now. So if I may segue, I think it's that indefatigable energy and the commitment not only to the principle of world peace and nuclear disarmament, but an orientation not towards fear-mongering, but to solutions that makes Alyn a fitting inheritor and torchbearer of the spirit and purpose that have animated both our respective organizations since their founding. And by way of introduction, if I may, I'd like to take a moment to situate today's conversation in the narrative of our organizations, WFM-IGP and CGS. So when we were respectively founded in 1947 in Asheville, North Carolina, and a few months later in Montreux, Switzerland, a declaration established 6 principles for world government, which included that world government should control nuclear weapons and other scientific discoveries that could lead to mass destruction. And as the U.S. arm of this movement, we at CGS and its forebearers by different names have always been keenly aware of our particular responsibility for the scourge of nuclear war. And there is a clear thread or through line from our leaders, from Norman Cousins, one of my predecessors who founded SANE in 1958, now known as Peace Action, to 60 years ago when we successfully advocated for President Kennedy to sign the partial nuclear test ban treaty, and our subsequent advocacy for every treaty or protocol on the issue of nuclear weapons, as well as for the establishment of such organs as the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, championed by Senator Hubert Humphrey, a friend of the movement, and the U.S. Institute for Peace, through the 1980s, convening bilateral and multilateral diplomacy with the Soviet Union and the United States, and through 1989, where I think a term that you're going to hear over the course of today's conversation came to light, common security, where the World Federalist Association, as we are known at that point, convened a gathering in Washington, D.C. of 72 co-sponsoring organizations to form the Alliance for a Common Future, recognizing that common security rather than nuclear deterrence would be a way forward. And outside traditional channels like those I've talked about, treaty bodies and institutional organs, our members and leaders have also trodden more precarious paths sometimes to bring the vision of a nuclear-free world to reality, including the late Daniel Ellsberg, a longtime member of our National Advisory Council at CGS, whom we lost earlier this year, and whose legacy I believe Alyn will reflect upon as a personal connection. So this brings us to today and the urgency and timeliness of today's the conversation in which we currently engage. So we're as busy as ever on this issue, and I look forward to Alyn sharing with everyone some of the work our organizations have been commonly undertaking and the contemporary approaches and strategies we need to move the needle forward, or maybe in the case of the Doomsday Clock, move the hands of the timepiece back. In the last several months alone, since we've assumed our respective positions at WFM and CGS, We've been privileged to cooperate on the NPT PrepCon in Vienna. We're represented by a program officer of CGS. as Alyn led on that initiative. I was privileged to join Alyn last week in Geneva for conversations on this issue. In 2 weeks, we will host a 3+3 delegation in Washington, D.C., and then Disarmament Week is upcoming in New York City in October. So as you can see, is quite a full docket, and the work is as vital as ever. A couple of months ago, the Stimson Center released a report that indicated that more than 60% of Americans would like to know more about nuclear policy. But at the same time, by a 5-to-1 ratio, Americans feel safer with our nuclear arsenal. And so that is why I think there is no better moment for today's talk and no better person to lead it than Alyn. So without further ado, give the floor to Alyn Ware.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you very much, Amy. And thank you everyone who's joined us. Today has been billed a discussion, which is why we're not in the specific webinar format. We're more in a meeting format, and why I will be talking a little bit in the beginning of this discussion to introduce you or update you on some of the approaches and the programs and projects, primarily for the World Federalist Movement, Institute for Global Policy, but many of these are in cooperation with other organizations, including organizations that I'm also involved in, like Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, Unfold Zero, No First Use Global, Abolition 2000, World Future Council. So some of these have been around, and we're elevating them and bringing them into the political context at the moment. And part of the initial discussion is, which I'll be talking about, is how we are shaping these projects and programs to deal with the political conditions that we're faced in. Before I start, I would like to pay tribute to Dan Ellsberg, a good friend, and I know many of you here also knew Dan. He was very active in the movement. Of course, he started in government and was involved as an intelligence analyst in the RAND Corporation, feeding information and analysis to the government. But what, as many of you know, he saw that there was cover-ups in terms of what the government was doing in Vietnam and neighboring countries, released the Pentagon Papers, was punished for this. He was a whistleblower. And then after that, he then became much more involved in engaging with civil society in these campaigns, seeing the need for civil society to pay attention to what governments are doing and to engage in policy. And he was very involved in the nuclear weapons issue. During his time as RAND Corporation, he'd been involved as part of the team that had been working on the CEOP. That's just the integrated operational plan of nuclear weapons, the possibilities and the plans for how the United States would think about using nuclear weapons in a whole range of different armed conflicts and situations. And through these, analysis of these operational plans, Dan Ellsberg came to the conclusion that any use of nuclear weapons would be catastrophic, that it could escalate. It'd be very difficult to hold that back. And really the only option with regards to the threat of nuclear weapons is to work for their elimination. So he became very active. As many of you know, nuclear disarmament, both personally, I know at one stage he was involved personally in a fast for nuclear disarmament during the one of the NPT review conferences. He was also active in writing about these issues, and his book, The Doomsday Machine, I would recommend. He was actively giving advice and support and feedback to us right up until a couple of weeks before he passed away. He was so committed to this issue. So a huge thank you to Dan for this. I know there will be a ceremony on October 22nd celebrating Dan Ellsberg's legacy, and we hope some of you will be able to join that as well. So moving on to this issue of the threat of nuclear weapons, and we've built this sort of coming from the Doomsday Clock, which is what the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists use to give a bit of a litmus test of how risky are these issues. The Doomsday Clock started with the risks of nuclear weapons. It's now moved on to also incorporate other risks. Risks of to the planet, existential threats to the planet from climate change, also from the increasing tensions and rivalries between superpowers, armed conflict that's happening, artificial intelligence, misinformation, a few other things. But still at the core of the Doomsday Clock, and one of the key risks is the threat that a conflict could escalate into a nuclear war, either through miscalculation, crisis escalation, or even by intent. And so this is one of the key areas that WFM, World Federalist Movement, is working on. But in order to deal with this issue, we have to look at why the nuclear weapon states and the allied states are relying on nuclear weapons, on nuclear deterrence. And Rebecca's pointed to this a little bit, in the survey. It's not just the leaders, it's people in these countries in some way feel, many of them feel secure. That security comes from this concept of nuclear deterrence. The idea that the threat of massive retaliation can prevent an aggressive state, an aggressive force, from invading your country. It's quite a strong security concept. That's why it's held very strongly by the nuclear weapon states, by the allied states, and by many of the people in the populations. So in order to move away from that and to encourage the governments and the people who believe that nuclear deterrence provides security, we have to find other ways of addressing those security threats that they see that nuclear weapons have a role for. The primary one is the threat of aggression. So this is where we're coming in with the idea of a common security framework to address the nuclear weapons issue. What a common security framework is it's looking at where there are threats, where there are unresolved conflicts between countries. The way to address those is not to threaten the use of force or to use force, but to use conflict resolution mechanisms and international law. Now, the Common Security Framework is framed very nicely by the UN Charter. The UN Charter, Article 2, puts forward a legal obligation for countries to resolve their conflicts through peaceful means, and a prohibition on the threat or use of force in these international relations. And Article 33 gives a number of mechanisms or methods for being able to do that, including negotiation, conciliation, mediation, arbitration, adjudication, recourse to regional bodies, and other peaceful means. So we have, in a sense, the basis there. The problem is these are not elevated sufficiently, used sufficiently, known enough by legislators, by governments, by the general population, and the effectiveness of them is not known. So this is why we're bringing in a new project called Law Not War, which is to help educate legislators, officials, governments, and public about these mechanisms, and in particular, the International Court of Justice. Because the International Court of Justice is set up as the supreme judicial organ of the UN system. It's also proven its worth. In the case history of the International Court of Justice, we have seen it address some very difficult issues, including territorial disputes, including the issue of genocide, in case there's actually a case of genocide on there now, including nuclear testing, the threat or use of nuclear weapons. And at the moment, there's a case on climate change there, which has been taken by the UN General Assembly, with the UN General Assembly deciding to do this without opposition. So we have in the court, already a number of cases. These cases have demonstrated that the court does mostly apply not a political approach. It's not lobbying of countries that determines what's the outcome of the decision of the court, but history, facts, and the law, and the application of those. And it's a balancing force. So a small, not so powerful, not so military powerful or politically powerful can take a much more powerful to the court, and on the basis of the facts and the law can win the case. And we've seen many examples of this. Nicaragua versus the United States, for example, New Zealand and Australia versus France over the nuclear testing. In those cases, even when the powerful countries try and resist the application of them, they have an incredible impact on the behavior, on the issue, and can provide a positive impact. And so this is why we're bringing that as one of the key common security mechanisms. There are others, and we lay them out on a common security resource on the Unfold Zero website. We have a page on common security, which outlines what common security is, how it works, and what some of the mechanisms are. And then for the NPT preparatory meeting in Vienna in August, we drafted a statement saying how this can help to resolve the nuclear weapons dilemma. how we can use the common security framework to engage with the nuclear weapon states. I mean, at the same time as criticizing the nuclear weapon states, we have to work with them to find these alternative security to the threat or use of force and the threat of nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence. So the statement gives some of the approaches, some of the ideas, and we had 170 organizations endorsing this, saying that this was a really important approach to take, because if you're looking in the NPT itself, or in some of the other in the Conference on Disarmament in New York, in Geneva, where the Conference on Disarmament runs, they seem blocked. There's sort of, one block of countries that have joined the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. They said, look, nuclear weapons, there's no legality or justification for them, but none of the nuclear weapon states or ally states have joined this. So they're on another block, and they're basically talking past each other. So in order to be able to get to a nuclear weapons-free world, we have to engage with those who have the nuclear weapons. And so in a sense, the common security approach is a bit like combining the carrot and the stick. The stick is the legal obligations, and we elevate those. The International Court of Justice in '96 affirmed that there is a legal obligation to pursue negotiations and bring them to a conclusion on nuclear disarmament in all its aspects. And in the meantime, the threat or use of nuclear weapons is generally illegal. And that was reaffirmed by the UN Human Rights Committee in 2018. We said the threat or use of nuclear weapons could be a violation of the right to life and could even arise to an international crime. And again, under human rights law, there is also an obligation to work for the elimination of nuclear weapons. So in a sense, that's sort of like the stick. Hey, you've got a legal obligation to do something. But there's also the carrot part, which I talk about, is how do you actually get the states to implement this, is you actually work with them, not against them. You talk with them about how can we implement this? How can we resolve some of these security issues in better ways? So that's the idea of the common security framework. Now that's at the international level. In her introduction, Rebecca also mentioned about one of the projects which we're working on with the 3+3 coalition for establishing a Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone. So in a sense, the nuclear weapon-free zones are taking this idea of common security, but implementing it at a regional level. And we've had a lot of success with this. We have nuclear weapon-free zones that have been established in Latin America, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, Africa, Central Asia, the seabed, outer space also. And in many of these, there were actually nuclear weapons activities, nuclear testing. There had been nuclear programs that were leading towards nuclear weapons, like Brazil, Argentina, for example, in Latin America. There had been nuclear weapons in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, for example, and they gave up those nuclear weapons on independence from the Soviet Union and helped then negotiate this Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone. So it's not that it was that the zones were completely free of nuclear activities. Some of them also have alliances, but the zones was a common security way because it was looking at making the region safer, lowering the role of nuclear weapons for everyone in the region, and then working with the nuclear weapon states to accept these regions by signing protocols which are providing negative security assurances, saying that nuclear weapon states will honor these zones. So this is the idea, a model, a regional cooperative common security approach, which we're now bringing into the Northeast Asia area, where you have North Korea with its own nuclear weapons, South Korea and Japan who rely on nuclear deterrence, and then China, Russia, and the United States as nuclear powers, all very active in the region. So the 3+3 model is a way of bringing all those 6 countries together in a way that all of their security will be enhanced, because it will lower the threats and risks to all of them by all of them reducing the role of nuclear weapons. And so this model, we are getting quite a lot of traction with. We've had events in parliaments in South Korea and Japan. We have a delegation, as Rebecca mentioned, of parliamentarians and experts coming from Japan and South Korea to Washington later this month in order to engage with legislators and their aides on the Hill, and also with some of the think tank communities in Washington, D.C. We've taken this into the Interparliamentary Union, and the Interparliamentary Union is 178 parliaments, and we've had conversations there with parliamentarians from South Korea, Japan, and even from North Korea. Which is really interesting, having conversations on this with parliamentarians from North Korea. So there's a buzz about this idea. And we've also done some diplomatic dialogues on this in Geneva with ambassadors or councillors from the 6 countries, and all of them expressed an interest, because all of them see this idea that, hey, this is something that could enhance our security. And they understand that this common security approach is much more sustainable security than continuing to rely on an adversarial system of security, of threatening others. So this is the common security approach we're bringing in. It has a really important focus on law. That's why Law Not War, which will be officially launching or publicly launching in October. And we see that Law Not War is also on the Unfold Zero website, because Unfold Zero is providing the platform for these things. And then along with that, we're also addressing one of the other aspects of the nuclear arms race, because it's not only about this perception of security provided by the nuclear weapons. There is also powerful vested economic interests in the nuclear arms race. This is particularly true in the United States and the United Kingdom. And so we see, for example, in the United States, that when, and I'll just give one example, when President Obama first came into power and negotiated the New START agreement with Russia, and the agreement was agreed by Russia, and that agreement was to basically cut the numbers of nuclear weapons. When he took it to the Congress to get ratified, because it has to be ratified by the Senate, the entire Republican caucus and even some of the Democrats said, well, we're not going to ratify this unless you increase the spending on nuclear weapons. Now, why would they say that? You have a treaty which is lowering the number of nuclear weapons, and here you have the senator saying, well, we're not going to endorse that unless you increase the money on weapons. That's because they've got nuclear industries in their states. There's a production. It's not just the warheads, it's the missiles, the submarines, and they're production facilities for these. There's the deployment sites for the missiles, and there's money coming into these states. And the nuclear weapons industry, there are about 27 corporations in the world that are involved in manufacturing the nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. And over a third of them are from the United States. Actually, half of them are from the United States. Some of the others are there's a couple of European, UK, of course, France. And these corporations are lobbying. They are lobbying for this money. And so we see them very active. Lockheed Martin is one of these that has incredible budget for lobbying Congress members on the Hill. And I think I saw Tad Daly here sort of with me. Tad actually took me into one of these clubs of the caucuses in the United States, where it was from the missile states. And here they were, and we could hear the speeches about talking about how we have to keep increasing the money for nuclear weapons, because that's bringing money to our states. So how do we address that? Senator Markey, who's the co-president of PND in the United States, is trying to do it by putting forward various pieces of legislation to cut certain nuclear weapon systems or the funding for them, but it's very difficult for him to get a majority. So we need to do a little bit more of elevating the initiatives in Congress, for example, like those that are led by Senator Markey. But also, we can do this in other countries that may not have their own nuclear weapons, but they may be investing in the nuclear weapons industry, either through their sovereign wealth funds or their pension funds or their banks. And so part of the campaign to cut the power of the nuclear weapons industry is also an international divestment campaign, stopping the investments in the nuclear weapons industry and encouraging investors to shift them into better things, into investing in social impact investment, which has just as good as rate of return as investing in the nuclear weapons industry. And I know this because we've had success at the government level in 4 countries so far: New Zealand, my country, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. And in New Zealand, for example, when the Superannuation Fund and the Accident Compensation Fund and a few others ended their investments in the nuclear weapons industry, their investment portfolio performance actually increased. It did not go down. And this is one of the things, of course, that is important when you're working with investors, is to give them confidence that if they're going to shift from investing in weapons, nuclear weapons, that it's not going to hurt their investment portfolio. We now have the experience to show that it doesn't. There are, as long as you've got wise investments, there are very good investments you can do, particularly an impact investment that will still keep the portfolio running well. So we have a campaign, nuclearweaponsmoney.org, which has both cutting the nuclear weapons budgets, but also ending the investments in nuclear weapons and helping investors along that path. I think that's probably all that I'll say at the moment. I think there's enough in that to indicate where we're coming from and why, with this common security framework, why governance is so important. Because common security needs global governance mechanisms. The International Court of Justice is one of those global governance mechanisms. We need to improve. The Security Council is one, but it's got defects, as we know. Because of the veto power, we've had to lean on the UN General Assembly to pick up issues when there's been veto exercised in the Security Council. So here, this is why World Federalist Movement is looking at the governance mechanisms, because the governance is very, very important. We have some that we can use. We can use the UN General Assembly more often when the Security Council, countries like Russia or the United States have a veto. Eventually, we want to get rid of the veto power, but that's not going to happen soon. So in the meantime, we can use these other mechanisms. I didn't mention another key mechanism that's part of this is the human rights bodies in Geneva, and more we can use particularly the Universal Periodic Review process in the human rights bodies to challenge the nuclear weapon states and their allied states to make progress on their obligations to phase out reliance on nuclear deterrence. But as I say, carrot and stick, not just to challenge them, but to give them solutions and to compliment them when they do good things, so that we're not coming in a sense being adversarial to these countries. We're coming to we're providing solutions that will help. It'll be in everyone's security, including those with the nuclear weapons, to move away from this very risky game of nuclear deterrence and move to much more sustainable common security, which will then also release these resources to address the issues we need to address, like climate change, sustainable development, etc. So I think that's enough of an introduction. I've laid out some of the projects and the reasons why we're doing those. And now let's open for comments, questions from people who are gathered here today. Thank you very much, both Amy and Rebecca, for opening up and providing the floor to bring these projects and ideas into this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alyn, for your reflections. There's quite a lot to unpack here, and I'm sure we have quite a few questions. So if you do have a question, please place it in the chat or raise your electronic or flash hand. I'd also like for everyone to note WFM's contact details, which I'll place in the chat. So please visit our website to keep updated on upcoming events and our work. You can also subscribe to our bulletin or join as a member on our website. So I see Rebecca has a question. Rebecca.
Sure, just as our other participants have a moment to reflect. Alyn, so part of the framing for today's discussion was around the Summit of the Future. And as we look for those opportunities, those windows, and those levers, I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit on what you see the Summit of the Future holding on this issue, and to glom more on there. Some of us will participate in a little bit over a week, in a high-level week, with the midpoint of the SDGs, of which there are 17. Both of these opportunities, I think, are hopefully open the door for issues of disarmament, but also are crowded spaces. And just sorry to pack a little bit more on, we also know that today is the G20 summit in a nuclear, not an NPT designated state, but in a nuclear state in India. And we, I think, have seen some progress and maybe some backsliding in previous G20s around nuclear issues. So what do all of these UN events hold, or global events, I should say, hold, and how can our communities and civil society take advantage of them?
Well, thank you very much for reminding me to discuss the Summit of the Future, which I know it's in the title, and I said we were going to discuss, so that's good. So the Summit of the Future is going to be happening in September 2024, and it was established by the UN General Assembly to enhance multilateralism for a better future. So what it's looking at is there is a breakdown of multilateralism with a retreat back into national and militarism, armed conflict, unresolved conflicts between countries, and the needs to enhance a multilateral approach. Now, multilateral approach is both good behavior by countries in using these mechanisms, but also ensuring that we've got good global governance mechanisms for them to use. So there's, in a sense, the Summit of the Future has got a twofold approach, which is looking at what are some good practices and policies that can be advanced to ensure a common sustainable future, and also what types of governance mechanisms might we need to bring in to the field. With the Sum of the Future, another aspect of it, which is really important, is it's not a single issue focus. It's very broad. It covers the range of issues: environment, human rights, civil rights, peace, disarmament. And in some ways that makes it a bit more complicated, and the preparatory process is quite difficult. There's a lot happening for the preparatory process because there are a lot of things feeding into it: a new agenda for peace, a new digital compact, principles on outer space. So there's a lot of things that are feeding into the Sum of the Future. But the positive thing is it's providing a lot more understanding of the connections between issues, and cooperation between those who are working on the different issues. So from the civil society side, there is a lot of coordination happening. Not all of it. I mean, there are a lot of civil society input into the Sum of the Future, but a lot of coordination is happening through the Coalition for the UN We Need, which arose from civil society organizations working together on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And then that's now moved into preparation primarily for the Summit of the Future. So the Coalition for the UN We Need has helped to bring the different types of civil society organizations together, provide a platform for them. 7 themes were sort of developed, and then there have been consultations over those themes, and also regional consultations. That's fed into the Global Futures Forum, the first one, which was held both in New York and hybrid in March of this year. And that produced what's called an interim People's Pact for the Future. So out of all of these consultations and deliberations, they were sort of compressed down into 33 proposals that have a lot of traction amongst civil society, that span the spectrum of the key themes and issues for the Summit of the Future, but also show a lot of interaction between them. And what that means is that I come in more from the peace and security side, and I was very much involved in those consultations. We actually had 40 proposals on peace and security. We had to bring them down to 5 or 6. But what it means is when we're taking forward these proposals, if we use the interim People's Pact for the Future in our engagement with legislators, with our government, with our foreign ministries or our environment ministries, our human rights areas, our legal departments, or with our ambassadors, in New York, if we're engaging in the process for the Summit of the Future, we can bring this, the People's Pact for the Future, we can elevate the key issues we're concerned about or most active in, and then we can say, and look, there's support from a much broader sector of civil society. So it broadens broadens and strengthens our impact. So this is really effective, I think, the way the Coalition for the UN has been doing this. The planning now, and we're part of the process, the Coalition for the UN We Need is planning a follow-up, a Global Futures Forum. It's not yet been decided, but the proposal is for it to be in Nairobi in Kenya, because that's another key UN hub, and one in the south, rather than just having all the UN events in the north. And so the best way of finding out about this is just to keep watching the C4UN webpage, and get onto the mailing list for that. So that's the Summit of the Future. And some of the proposals, some of the ideas I've been talking about are actually fed into the proposals. The idea of better use of the International Court of Justice is one of the ones that's made it into the 5 in the peace and security side. On the nuclear weapons side, the proposal that's made it into those 5 is a calling for the Summit of the Future to support an aspirational commitment to the elimination of nuclear weapons no later than 2045. Without saying specifically how it should be done, because that's a bit more divisive. It should be a bit more easier to get it into that. And that also is calling for the inclusion of nuclear disarmament as one of the post-2030 Sustainable Development Goals, because nuclear disarmament was proposed to be included in the current round of SDGs, but the powerful political forces kept that out. What we now have, because we're building cooperation with the sustainable development community, with human rights communities, with environment communities, is that we're getting more power to bring this into the next round of SDGs. So that's part of there as well. So that's on the Summit of the Future. And then the other thing that Rebecca mentioned was the G20. The G20 is happening in India at the moment. Why is this important? So the G20 is again, another body which is of a high level. I mean, the leaders of the G20 countries are coming together in Delhi. Previous to this, they were together in Bali, in Indonesia, in November last year. And in the summit in Bali, the final declaration, paragraph 4, is quite incredible. Paragraph 4 was very strongly supportive of the UN, and particularly, the prohibition of the threat or use of force. It affirmed that, this century should be a century not of war, but of peace, and also the inadmissibility of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. Now, why this is so significant is because there are 6 nuclear armed states that were there and 7 allied states that were there out of the 20. So the majority of them rely on nuclear weapons. And yet I think they got a little bit of a shock at how close and how risky we were getting in the Russia invasion of Ukraine, that issue. It was elevating the risk of nuclear weapons, but not only there, also in the conflicts that were happening with North Korea and in the South China Sea. So I think the leaders were saying, we need to sort of at least ensure that we don't end up with a nuclear war. So let's say the threat or use of nuclear weapons inadmissible. It was done at the political level, and I don't think they had defense officials in Bali. And I think some of these countries, when they got home, I think some of the defense departments gave some kickback. So we've been talking, with some of the G20 countries that paved the way for that language, and they're saying, it's much more difficult to get it, adopted or reaffirmed in India. But it's also indicating that it's actually very significant. If there was kickback on this, it means it's actually hitting a nerve that's actually really important. So what we've done, and this is WFM in cooperation with No First Use Global and various others, is launched a declaration of public conscience to affirm that statement. The threat or use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible, and call for its reaffirmation and its implementation. And we have got 1,100, we've got 22,000 now endorsers of that. And many of them are former high-level officials, academics, parliamentarians, etc. So that, which is nuclear taboo from norm to law, I'll put the link in the chat later on. You can endorse, because we present it to the G7 summit in Hiroshima. Next, we're going to present it to the UN in October. So yes, that G20 process is something to watch closely, because this is where, as I said, the nuclear armed and many of the allied states are there, and they're having these discussions about the threat or use of nuclear weapons, and we can have an impact feeding into this process.
Thanks, Alyn. Bruce?
Yes, thank you for a wonderful presentation. You said something that I actually didn't know, and I worked on as part of civil society for the Sustainable Development Goals. And I didn't know that nuclear weapons was actually one of the things that was considered for that. So that's new information for me, and thanks for providing that. What I do know is that we worked really hard on the Sustainable Development Goals, and we had a lot of accountability mechanisms into these goals. And the last night, after midnight, before the deadline, or even past the deadline, the major countries, the United States, the big countries, got together and stripped out the accountability mechanisms. And I'm wondering, can you tell us more about how nuclear weapons got dropped out of the Sustainable Development Goals? Who was responsible for that? What was their rationale? I just would like to interrogate that just a little bit more.
Yeah, I know secondhand, because I wasn't there. I wasn't on the negotiating team, but I was working closely with in New Zealand with our Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control at the time, was Marion Hobbs, and she was pushing quite strongly for this to be included in the SDGs, and with a like-minded group of countries. I can't recall what the other members were. Her report back that it was very strongly opposed by France, also opposed by United States and Russia. But I don't know the details of exactly how they were doing that. It's only secondhand report to me from speaking with our Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control. There may be others who are more closely involved in the SDG process, but the other person I have talked to is the person who's now running an initiative from under the Hiroshima governor, and the Hiroshima governor and the prefecture has launched what's called HOPE, Hiroshima Organization for International Peace. And the primary objective of HOPE is to get nuclear disarmament into the next round of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the program director for that, who's running this initiative and speaks at some of our events, was on the Japanese team for negotiating the SDGs, and also saw the opposition to nuclear weapons getting in, but I haven't gone through what details sort of he knows about that. There may be others who may be able to offer a little bit more on that. What I see is that with this initiative from the Hiroshima prefecture, that gives us a greater capacity to be able to bring nuclear disarmament into the next round of the Sustainable Development Goals, plus also the way that we are engaging much more now with the Sustainable Development community. I think when we were trying to take it in the earlier round, it was sort of like different communities that hadn't really worked very much together. Nuclear disarmament, peace and disarmament community hadn't really been working a lot with the Sustainable Development communities. Now there's a lot more cooperation and working in there. So I think there's a lot more capacity to take this forward, because we're much stronger working with our colleagues, from these other communities.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if anyone would like to respond to Bruce. If not, there's a few questions in the chat that would be good to address. So Bob Flax asks, short of a world federation, is there a way to increase the enforcement of treaties, ICJ rulings, etc.?
Yes. Of course, we want to move towards more, I'd say, world federalism. Whether we get to a total world federation in my lifetime or not, I don't know, but we can definitely increase world federalism, which is better global governance. And on that, at the moment, we have capacities to use the International Court of Justice more and better than we are doing. Already, we have various options of getting to the court. The one that everybody sort of knows about and sort of talks about is countries accepting the compulsory jurisdiction of the court for any disputes between them and other states who have also given a declaration of acceptance. And that, the 73 countries have accepted that. And one of the criticisms of those of the international court and international law, or the pessimists, say, well, look at all the countries who don't accept the jurisdiction, it doesn't have any impact. But that's only one way of getting a case to the court. There are other ways. So another way is within treaties themselves, within a number of treaties, there are articles which refer to using the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, or sometimes it's a combination of either the International Court of Justice or a special tribunal or arbitration, which is, for example, in the Convention of the Law of the Sea, it's got the option of all three, or some are only focused on the International Court of Justice. So if there is a dispute under that treaty with another party to that treaty, then either of those parties can take that case to the court. So we have, for example, a case at the moment in the International Court of Justice on genocide. Ukraine has taken Russia to the court. Russia doesn't accept the jurisdiction of the court for general legal disputes between them and other countries, but they are a party to the Genocide Convention, as is Ukraine. So that case has been accepted and is now playing out in the International Court of Justice. So one way we can do this is use these provisions more. A lot of people don't realize that these provisions are in many of these treaties. And in fact, this particular case, the one on genocide, it's actually a pity that it wasn't done earlier. These allegations from Russia about genocide in the Donbas region were emerging from like 2015, 2016. And it would have been much better if this case would be taken to the court back then, rather than waiting for Russia to invade Ukraine and then taking them to court. It's sort of like, after the horse has already bolted, trying to close the door. The best thing is close the door before the horse bolts. So we need to use these mechanisms more. And there's also another way, which is the advisory opinion approach to the court. So even if it's not in a treaty, and even if the parties or one of the parties to this conflict doesn't accept the jurisdiction of the court, you can still take a case to the court if you can get one of the key UN bodies, and the UN General Assembly is probably the best to do this, to take the case. So, for example, the situation of Southwest Africa, and the imposition of apartheid in that region from South Africa was taken to the International Court of Justice through an advisory opinion, and it helped pave the way for independence of Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. So that's another approach that we need to use more, the advisory opinion approach. And then finally, two countries can just decide by mutual agreement to take a case to the court, and they often do. There's, I think, about 15 cases in the court's history where two countries have decided, hey, this is a good way for us to do it, because basically it takes it out of the political realm. It provides a possibility to put in historical background. It gives breathing space, and quite often through taking the case to the court, it then provides a better basis for those two countries to negotiate a peaceful settlement of the dispute. So better use of the International Court of Justice. The other thing is implementation of decisions from the court. A decision from the court is not the end, of course, the implementation, but there's many ways of implementing decisions from the court through domestic legislation. That's one way, through UN General Assembly resolutions, through civil society action. There are so many ways. And it's interesting that when you talk to like judges from the court and say, well, what's the value of you making these decisions when you don't have an enforcement body? Many of the judges will say, actually, that's not the most important thing. It's not whether you can enforce it, it's whether it's implemented. And the majority of the cases are implemented. Talk to any of the judges from the court, current or former, and they will say this. So I say better use. Now, I've just talked about the International Court of Justice. There are other tribunals, and maybe Rebecca wants to mention a bit about some of the other ones because she's a real expert. Next week, I'm going to be over in Hamburg for the ITLOS, the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, because that's also addressing the climate issue. So when you're looking at global governance, it's not just one global governance body. There are a range of governance bodies and legal bodies, tribunals. There are a range of them. The International Criminal Court is one that Rebecca has had a lot of experience in and may want to mention a little bit. So what I'm saying is, even without the enforcement body, or a good enforcement body, because there's problems with the Security Council, these tribunals are really effective and should be used more.
Mm-hmm. So it looks like Rebecca wants to add to your point. So Rebecca and then Bob.
Sure. Well, I'll start with the ICJ, just extrapolating on a couple of Alyn's points. Number one, in terms, and I put this in the chat, when we think about using treaties to bring cases before the court, the Ukraine case of genocide is an obvious one. What is less obvious is the use of the Genocide Convention by the Gambia against Myanmar. And this is a really fascinating use of universal jurisdiction, or jurisdiction that is basically universal because basically everybody is signed up to the Genocide Treaty. And it serves a very powerful diplomatic purpose for the Gambia as well. And in terms of interstate disputes where there is not compulsory jurisdiction, this is also sometimes a gentle person's way out before things escalate. And we see now territorial disputes in several corners of the world. I was speaking to colleagues yesterday over the course of the past week in India about territorial disputes with India and China, that if we could just bring this before the ICJ, maybe we don't have to have a diplomatic standoff. So that's in the case of both treaty disputes and accepting limited jurisdiction, absent the compulsory jurisdiction and absent referral by the UNGA, which is the fourth mechanism, which brings, for example, the unique and unprecedented cause of what is state responsibility for climate degradation and environmental justice before the court right now that we're seeing. Moving over to the ICC for a minute, the ICC has limited jurisdiction as well and is only for personal criminal responsibility, I think, as many people in this proverbial room, will be aware. I will put into the chat an article, to be completely honest, that I've co-authored on 5 ways to reset the U.S. relationship with the International Criminal Court. The U.S. has been a persistent not only non-state party, but bugaboo to the ICC, more so over the previous administration, but now shows signs of cooperation. And the ICC is an incredibly valuable tool. And the announcement a couple of months ago that the Biden administration will lend cooperation in investigations and prosecution in the situation in Ukraine is very much welcomed. However, this is an ad hoc and exceptional instance. Over the course, and I'm speaking because I recognize this is a predominantly maybe US audience. I see some Canadian faces, some other faces on there, but I'm speaking primarily to a US audience. So over the course of the last legislative cycle, at the end of 2022, there were significant reforms to the so-called Dodd Amendment for carve-outs for cooperation with the ICC that related to Ukraine specifically, but could be interpreted more broadly in terms of cooperation with the court. And so I will put the article in the chat, and it looks at ways to bring those who commit atrocity crimes to justice with US involvement. Beyond the ICC and ICJ, our organization, Citizens for Global Solutions, also entertains ideas for new courts, including a World Court of Human Rights. There are currently regional courts for human rights in Europe and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, but there is no no global jurisdiction for such crimes. And I think there was a question at some point about corporate responsibility for I think it was around nuclear, but the same could be said about environmental crimes, etc. So where do you go when you have a corporation that maybe does not fit within the remit of a domestic jurisdiction, that there isn't an ICC or an ICJ. ICJ is between states, ICC is for individual criminal responsibility, and maybe you're not in a region that has a court of human rights that you can bring that actor to justice. And so there have been movements to that end and to the end of an international anti-corruption court as well. And I'm sorry, I know we're running late on time, and Bob's had his hand up for a very long time. I'm so sorry, Bob, but happy to answer questions in the chat. I'll put the article in the chat.
Yeah, and no problem. That was fine. So I just wanted to drill down another moment into the enforcement part of it, rather than getting a case to a court, whether it's the ICJ, ICC, or whatever. That if you have a situation where you have an autocracy, a dictatorship, whatever, and they just don't care, is there anything that could be done under our current structure to increase enforcement in those kinds of situations? Because those are the ones that seem to be the most problematic. And maybe there isn't, but I just wanted to get a sense if there might be. Thank you.
Shall I quickly take that question? Yes. What happens? Again, I prefer to use the word implementation rather than enforcement, because there's many aspects to how you can enhance implementation. And we see this, with some of the decisions from the International Court of Justice that have been gone against powerful countries. Like the nuclear test case that went against France, for example. We basically had two cases, 1974, that went against France. And what did France do at that? They actually withdrew their acceptance of the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. And so it looked as though, oh dear, we have no capacity to be able to enforce this, because they're also a member of the Security Council with veto power. So what can we do? The really interesting thing is, though, is that this decision was really influential within France. Even though the parliament is not really able to raise this issue, it wasn't back in 1974, because it was the prerogative of the government, not the parliament. The very fact that France was called out was an issue, and it provided like an internal impetus for them to move ahead. And they basically ended their atmospheric testing in 75, went underground, and then when they were taken back to the court in 1995 over the underground testing, they basically said, well, we're not really going to listen to the court. But they closed down the test site totally the following year, and signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and have actually been a really big supporter of it since. That's one country. Okay, one might say, okay, it's a little bit more democratic in France than, say, Russia. What might be the impact of a decision on Russia? Well, here I'll point to the 1996 advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. What happened in 98, 2 years after the decision from the court, was Russia then came with their new doctrine on nuclear weapons, and they actually used language coming specifically from the court, that the policy of Russia is to threaten or use nuclear weapons only when there's a threat to the survival of Russia. Now, this is played out again even in the conflict with Ukraine. Putin wasn't really paying much attention to this and was making all these threats, from the day he invaded. in Ukraine, saying we're a nuclear armed state, don't interfere, to NATO countries, and then when he annexed, the additional territories, again said they're now part of Russia and we've got nuclear weapons. But both times, the foreign minister, Lavrov, would actually then give a qualifying statement saying, well, actually, the policy of Russia is to threaten or use nuclear weapons when, the existence of Russia is at stake. So here you can see that the legal opinion, from the court was having an influence at the operational level in Russia. And I can say the same about the United States. Prior to us taking the case to the International Court of Justice, I talked about the SEOP plan, the Integrated Operational Plan for the Use of Nuclear Weapons. I had called up the Chief Judge Advocate's office in the United States and had a conversation about, so what were their perspectives on SEOP, which of the possible uses of nuclear weapons by the United States would be consistent with international humanitarian law and other laws of warfare, and which wouldn't. And the answer was, we've never done that analysis. And I said, well, isn't your office supposed to be doing that, for military operations? And they said, yeah, for military operations, we're supposed to do that. I said, well, why haven't you done it we do it for other military operations, so why haven't you done it with nuclear weapons? We haven't been asked. Oh, so who would need to ask you? The commander responsible. They had not done it, basically, before the decision from the court, but after, they then started looking at the application of laws of warfare to the nuclear weapons operational plan, to such the degree that when we had the hearings in the Senate, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the presidential authority to use nuclear weapons, a former commander of NORAD basically said, if the president gave an illegal order, to use nuclear weapons, we would have to tell the president, Mr. President, that is illegal. That's violating the laws of warfare. So we see that two powerful countries, okay, one slightly more democratic than the other, but still democratic deficit in the United States, both of them appear to be impacted by the decision from the court without sort of publicly saying that it was specifically the court that did it, but you can actually see it having an influence. And there are many other examples I give. We don't have time to do that. And I know there's one other question that I need to address after Rebecca's given a quick response to this as well. Rebecca?
Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to use the example that Alyn raised earlier of Nicaragua v. US. So this is a case in which the US failed to comply with the ICJ's judgment, and therefore you would think that this was a failure of international law. And then a group of world federalists and citizens of US citizens based in Nicaragua brought suit in federal court. And that suit also lost. However, at that point, the public consciousness was raised to such an extent that I would agree. I would argue that it was seminal to a change of policy. So I don't think that the average US citizen cares or knows very much what the ICJ is doing. But there has been at least this trickle-down effect. And fun fact, who represented the Department of Justice at a junior level in that case for the United States is currently the Chief Justice of the ICJ, Judge Joan Donoghue, the third woman and first American to sit in that role.
Yeah, I'll follow up with two quick comments on that. Joan Donoghue gave an incredible presentation to the Security Council in January this year on the importance of accepting jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice and why that was going to be valuable to countries around the world. So that was it was a Security Council debate run by Japan when they had the presidency of the Security Council. One quick comment. And the other one on the Nicaragua case, I've talked with Oscar Arias and others who are involved in the negotiation of the Central American Peace Accords, and they said that case, the Nicaragua versus the United States, was instrumental in giving Costa Rica the capacity to engage the other Central American countries in the negotiations for the Central American Peace Accords. It provided the legal framework for being able to do that. It also provided support from Europe. Now, even though, as Rebecca said, in the United States, it was a bit mixed, but the policy did move. There was also the Bolden Amendment that was happening in Congress at the time that was also restricting the US governments. Europe basically then gave support to the legal process that had been started with the Nicaragua versus United States case and continued with the Central American Peace Accords. And then if you don't permit me a little bit more time, Amy, I do want to address the question that was asked by, is it John Pawlikowski about the proposed repurposing of the Trusteeship Council because this is one of the really interesting proposals that the UN Secretary General himself has raised and put forward as an idea in his agenda. It's something that's been suggested and proposed for the Summit of the Future. We don't know if it will get accepted. It probably won't at the Summit of the Future, but this could pave the way. Now, there are a couple of different proposals for repurposing the Trusteeship Council. And for those of you who don't know the Trusteeship Council, it was set up as a principal organ of the United Nations in order to provide UN trusteeship over territories that may have been sort of like occupied by certain countries during the Second World War and needed to come out and like find their way to be independence. So it was a temporary process in order to help countries to become independent. So they were under this trusteeship until they became independent. All those countries have now become independent, so the Trusteeship Council, as a formal body, hasn't really been doing anything. The council's used for other purposes. So the idea of repurposing the Trusteeship Council, one proposal is to repurpose it to provide trusteeship over disputed territories. But that's not really flying it very much, because we have better processes for doing that, for example, through the International Court of Justice. The other proposal, which is getting traction, is the idea of repurposing the Trusteeship Council in order to provide governance over the global commons. And this mixes well with the idea of trusteeship, because the idea of trusteeship is something which you don't own yourself, but you have a responsibility to look after, to protect for current and future generations. The global commons also are parts of the planet that aren't owned by any country. So the global commons include, for example, the oceans, the atmosphere, outer space, Antarctica, the seabed. These are the key global commons at the moment. And they're not managed very well. It's a mismatch of treaties and things. Did I say the oceans in there? That's one of them. So the idea is the Trusteeship Council could be, if it was repurposed to provide governance of the global commons, that could be a really effective use, because you've already got all the UN member states there. You can bring in a little bit more cohesion over the different global commons, and you've got capacity to bring in new principles, such as enhancing the trusteeship principle, which I know, we're also involved in an initiative called the Earth Trusteeship Initiative, which is really moving forward and taking this idea of repurposing the Trusteeship Council. So I think it's a really good idea. I'm not sure if it will get accepted at the Summit of the Future, but if it doesn't get accepted, we can build traction around this idea and take it forward. It's one model, one proposal for governance in the environmental sphere. It doesn't address all of the environmental issues, of course, because it's only about the global commons. So it doesn't rule out other initiatives, which Rebecca has been talking about. But I think it's a very useful initiative. Some of these governance mechanisms and proposals for them have been reviewed in the Climate Governance Commission, and the Climate Governance Commission is going to come out with its report very soon. I can't remember the exact date. Maybe Rebecca might know. And what we're looking at with World Federalist Movement and Citizens for Global Solutions and World Future Council is we're forming a global governance alliance called MEGA, Mobilizing Earth Governance Alliance, in order to pick up some of these recommendations and proposals from the Climate Governance Commission and other ones that are out there, and provide a way of building cooperation on taking forward these governance mechanisms on the environment. And we'll be launching MEGA in November.
Thank you, Alyn. And there's one more question in the chat that I'm really curious about myself, so maybe you can answer it really briefly. So John Harwich wants to know, regarding Bob's question on implementation, has the World Bank and other banks been approached to hold their loans to countries who don't comply?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm
Rebecca?
not an expert on the World Bank. If there's anyone else who has had more relation with the World Bank, I'd be quite open for them making a comment.
I don't fully know the answer, but I will state that many of the countries that are not in compliance are the countries that are givers, not recipients, not in compliance with international law, such as my own sometimes. So I think that's a partial answer, but not a complete answer to the question. And I look forward to actually addressing this. And I think we know the correct individuals with whom to speak to get a good answer for you.
Dan?
Yes, if I could just add to that, 20 years ago, when I was involved more with the World Bank, there weren't too many people there who were concerned about human rights, nature's rights. But things are different now. And so that's why I put the question in. We could explore.
There is a wonderful volume that we recently explored at CGS. We have something called our book club on global governance institutions for the 21st century, which was co-authored by 3 individuals: Augusto Lopez Claros, who is a former World Bank and IMF official who thinks broadly about these issues and in terms of a human rights perspectives; Maya Groff from the Climate Governance Commission, which was mentioned earlier; and Arthur Dahl, who might be known to many of you as a World Federalist and with many hats that he wears. I would like to go back to them to pose this issue and this question and come to you with a more fulsome answer.
I am in and out of the Inter-American Human Rights Court here in Costa Rica, and I have mentioned that to them. So planting seeds, yeah.
Thank you, John, for that question. And that brings us to the end of our time. So thank you all for your presence and your engagement today. Please stay connected with us and keep an eye out for upcoming events via the details that I've provided in the chat. And enjoy the rest of your weekend, everybody. Thanks, Alyn.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.